The Molotov cocktail crashed through the stained glass window of 16th Street Baptist Church at 10:22 a.m. on September 15, 1963. 4 little girls, Addie Mae Collins, Cynthia Wesley, Carol Robertson, and Denise McNair, were adjusting their white dresses in the basement bathroom, giggling about Sunday school. The explosion silenced their laughter forever. 22 others lay bleeding in the rubble, their Sunday best now stained crimson. But this wasn't just another racist attack on innocent children. This was a calculated strike at the very heart of America's freedom movement. The Ku Klux Klan knew exactly what they were targeting, not just a building, but the nerve center of revolution. For decades, black churches had served as more than places of worship. They were the underground headquarters, where ordinary people transformed into warriors for justice. Inside these sacred walls, maids who cleaned white folks' houses by day planned boycotts that would bring entire cities to their knees. Sharecroppers who couldn't read learned to organize voter registration drives. Teenagers discovered they had the power to face down police dogs and fire hoses. The pews that held Sunday congregations became the war rooms where America's most important battle was strategized. The bombers understood what many still don't grasp today. These churches weren't just spiritual sanctuaries, they were the beating heart of a revolution that would reshape a nation. Every hymn sung was an anthem of resistance. Every sermon preached was a battle cry for freedom. Every prayer offered was ammunition against centuries of oppression. That morning in Birmingham, as rescue workers pulled broken bodies from the debris, they were witnessing more than a terrorist attack. They were seeing the price America's freedom fighters paid for daring to believe that all of God's children deserved equality. The question that hung in the smoke-filled air wasn't just who committed this atrocity, but how many more would die before the headquarters of hope could finally claim victory. The story you're about to hear isn't the sanitized version they taught you in school. This is the raw, unfiltered truth about how America's black churches became the command centers of the most successful nonviolent revolution in human history. While textbooks focus on famous leaders and landmark legislation, the real story unfolds in the pews, basements, and fellowship halls where ordinary people found extraordinary courage. From the moment enslaved Africans first gathered in secret to worship, these churches became more than religious institutions. They evolved into fortresses of resistance. They were the Underground Railroad's most trusted stations, Reconstruction's organizing hubs, and the Civil Rights Movement's strategic headquarters. When Jim Crow laws tried to silence black voices, church bells rang out in defiance. When segregation tried to divide communities, church doors opened wide in unity. This isn't just history, it's a blueprint for how oppressed people can organize, strategize, and overcome seemingly impossible odds. In an era where social movements struggle to sustain momentum, the Black Church's century-long campaign offers invaluable lessons. These congregations mastered the art of turning pain into power, fear into faith, and dreams into irresistible demands for justice. You'll witness how teenage girls in party dresses became freedom fighters, how janitors became generals in the war against inequality, and how Sunday sermons became the most dangerous speeches in America. You'll see why white supremacists understood that bombing a church wasn't just attacking a building, it was attempting to destroy the very soul of the freedom movement. This is the story of how faith became a weapon, how prayer became protest, and how the most sacred spaces in Black America became the most feared by those who profited from oppression. Subscribe for more powerful stories like this, and tell me in the comments what country and city you're watching from. The summer heat in Montgomery, Alabama, on December 1st, 1955, felt different, thick with tension that had been building for generations. Rosa Parks settled into her seat on the Cleveland Avenue bus, her calloused hands folding neatly over her purse. She had no idea that her refusal to surrender her seat would ignite a revolution. But she knew exactly where that revolution would be planned. The arrest happened swiftly, the handcuffs clicking shut with the finality of a church bell. Word spread through Montgomery's black community like wildfire through dry grass. By evening, phone calls connected every major church in the city. The network that had been quietly organizing for decades suddenly sprang into action with military precision. Dexter Avenue Baptist Church stood like a fortress in the heart of downtown Montgomery. Its red brick walls had witnessed countless strategy sessions. Its basement had hosted secret meetings. Its fellowship hall had fed hungry organizers. Tonight, it would become ground zero for a movement that would reshape America. The young pastor, Martin Luther King Jr., paced the sanctuary floor, knowing that history was demanding an answer. The Montgomery Improvement Association didn't just spontaneously appear. It emerged from infrastructure that black churches had been building for over a century. These congregations had mastered the art of invisible organization. Sunday services provided cover for resistance planning. Church suppers became fundraising operations. Prayer meetings transformed into tactical discussions about economic warfare. Across town at Holt Street Baptist Church, over 4,000 people packed into every available space. They spilled from pews onto windowsills, crowded into aisles, and pressed against walls. The church's aging wooden floors creaked under the weight of a community that had found its voice. When King rose to speak, his words carried the power of centuries of suppressed rage, channeled through unshakable faith. The bus boycott that began the next morning wasn't just about transportation. It was economic combat, planned in church basements and executed with religious precision. For 381 days, Montgomery's black churches served as the headquarters of a carefully orchestrated campaign that brought the city's bus system to its knees. They provided the meeting spaces, the communication networks, the financial resources, and the spiritual strength necessary to sustain such massive resistance. Church ladies, who had spent lifetimes serving white families as maids, suddenly found themselves commanding carpools with military efficiency. Deacons, who had quietly endured decades of humiliation, became logistics coordinators for a movement that required moving 17,000 people daily without using public transportation. Sunday school teachers transformed into grassroots organizers, knocking on doors and registering voters. The white power structure watched in growing alarm as these simple churchfolk demonstrated organizational capabilities that rivaled Fortune 500 companies. What they failed to understand was that black churches had been preparing for this moment since the first African was forced onto American soil. Every spiritual sung in slavery, every underground prayer meeting, every quiet act of defiance had been building toward this crescendo. When the Supreme Court finally declared Montgomery's bus segregation unconstitutional, the victory celebration took place not in government buildings or civic centers, but in the churches where the battle had been planned and won. The sanctuary of Dexter Avenue Baptist rang with freedom songs that had sustained the movement through its darkest hours. But as champagne glasses clinked and voices soared in triumphant hymns, everyone understood that Montgomery was just the beginning. The success had proven that black churches possessed something more dangerous than weapons or wealth. They had the power to transform ordinary people into unstoppable agents of change. And across the South, white supremacists were taking careful notes, planning their retaliation against these headquarters of hope. The dynamite blast that shattered the pre-dawn silence of January 10th, 1957, sent shockwaves far beyond the walls of 4 black churches in Montgomery. The bombers had chosen their targets with calculated precision, not randomly selected buildings, but the specific congregations that had served as command centers for the bus boycott. The message was unmistakable: attack the movement's headquarters, and you can kill the revolution itself. Reverend Ralph Abernathy emerged from the smoking ruins of his home, his family miraculously unharmed, but his resolve hardened into steel. First Baptist Church, where he pastored, had been bombed hours earlier. The attackers understood what many civil rights historians would later overlook, that the real power of the movement didn't flow from charismatic leaders alone. but from the institutional strength of black churches that had been organizing communities for generations. Bell Street Baptist Church's sanctuary lay in ruins, its pews scattered like broken bones across the floor. The fellowship hall, where hundreds of boycott meetings had been held, was now a crater filled with debris and shattered dreams. But within hours, congregants were clearing rubble with their bare hands, determined to rebuild not just their church, but their movement's nerve center. The bombers had miscalculated catastrophically. Instead of intimidating black communities into submission, the attacks transformed every black church in the South into a fortress of resistance. Deacons who had never touched weapons suddenly found themselves standing guard with shotguns during evening services. Church mothers who had spent lifetimes preaching nonviolence now kept baseball bats hidden beneath altar cloths. Mount Olive Baptist Church in Terrell County, Georgia, became a target because Reverend C.C. Chatmon had dared to register black voters. The night riders came with gasoline and matches, but they found the congregation waiting. Armed church members surrounded the building in protective circles, their weapons gleaming in the moonlight. The Klan retreated, understanding that these sanctuaries would no longer be defenseless targets. The federal government watched nervously as black churches transformed into militarized zones. FBI agents infiltrated congregations, taking careful notes on sermons that increasingly blended scripture with revolutionary rhetoric. J. Edgar Hoover's reports described black ministers as dangerous agitators who used religious authority to mobilize communities for subversive activities, like voting and demanding equal treatment. Trinity Baptist Church in Selma, Alabama, installed floodlights around its perimeter and organized rotating security patrols. The church basement, once used for simple Sunday school classes, now stored communication equipment that connected civil rights organizers across state lines. What appeared to be Bible study groups were actually sophisticated intelligence networks tracking Klan movements and police brutality. Insurance companies began canceling policies on black churches, claiming they were high-risk properties involved in political activities. Banks refused loans for repairs and renovations. The economic warfare was designed to financially strangle these centers of resistance, but black communities responded with ingenious funding strategies. Church suppers became million-dollar fundraising operations. Offering plates filled with dollars that should have bought groceries instead rebuilt bombed sanctuaries. The most devastating attack came on September 15, 1963, when the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing murdered 4 little girls preparing for Sunday service. But even this unspeakable tragedy couldn't break the spirit of congregations who understood that their churches were more than buildings. They were symbols of black America's refusal to accept second-class citizenship as rescue workers pulled bodies from the Birmingham debris. Church bells across the South began tolling in unison. It wasn't just a memorial for the dead children, it was a declaration of war. Every black church in America had become a target, which meant every black church in America had also become a weapon in the fight for freedom. The bombers thought they were attacking buildings made of brick and mortar. They discovered they were assaulting institutions built from faith and fury, communities forged in centuries of struggle, and networks of resistance that ran deeper than Southern roots. The churches would not only survive these attacks, they would emerge stronger, more determined, and infinitely more dangerous to the system that tried to destroy them. The basement of Quinn Chapel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Chicago hummed with activity that would have terrified Southern sheriffs and federal agents alike. Maps covered every wall, marked with red pins, indicating planned protest sites across Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia. Young college students huddled over mimeograph machines, printing thousands of flyers that would flood black communities with instructions for voter registration drives and economic boycotts. This was 1961, and America's black churches had evolved into something unprecedented, a sophisticated underground network rivaling the intelligence operations of major governments. The same congregations that had once hidden runaway slaves were now coordinating the most complex civil rights campaign in human history. Prayer meetings had become strategy sessions. Church suppers financed revolution. Sunday services recruited armies of activists. Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth paced the fellowship hall of Bethel Baptist Church in Birmingham, his scarred face a testament to multiple assassination attempts. The church's walls bore bullet holes from drive-by shootings. Its windows were covered with plywood from repeated bombings, but its basement buzzed with the energy of war planners preparing for battle. Tonight's meeting would coordinate protests across 6 states. Simultaneously, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference hadn't chosen Birmingham. Randomly, they had selected it because Bethel Baptist and other black churches had already established the infrastructure necessary to sustain massive civil disobedience. These congregations possessed something more valuable than money or weapons. They had created trust, networks that could mobilize entire communities. Within hours of receiving coded phone calls, Dorothy Cotton's voice carried across the sanctuary of citizenship education program training, sessions that transformed ordinary church members into sophisticated political organizers. Sharecroppers who couldn't read learned to analyze voting laws. Domestic workers who cleaned white folks' houses mastered the complexities of constitutional law. Teenagers who had never traveled beyond county lines studied maps of the entire South, planning freedom rides that would challenge segregation from Virginia to Louisiana. The communication system that connected these church headquarters was a marvel of grassroots engineering. Reverend C.T. Vivian coordinated a network of over 200 congregations using nothing more than rotary telephones and mimeograph machines. When police raided one church, coded messages instantly alerted dozens of others. When authorities arrested key leaders, backup teams immediately assumed command from predetermined locations. Highlander Folk School in Tennessee served as the movement's unofficial university, but the real education happened in church basements, where Septimus Clark taught citizenship schools that were actually revolutionary training programs. Participants learned far more than reading and arithmetic. They mastered voter registration procedures, constitutional rights, protest tactics, and jail survival techniques. These schools graduated freedom fighters, not just literate citizens. The financial operations hidden within church budgets would have impressed Wall Street accountants. Offering plates collected funds that were immediately transferred to bail bond accounts for arrested protesters. Church building funds secretly purchased buses for freedom rides. Missionary societies laundered money that supported organizers working in the most dangerous counties of Mississippi and Alabama. Every dollar was carefully tracked and strategically deployed. White authorities grew, increasingly paranoid as they realized these simple country churches were orchestrating campaigns that required military-level logistics. How could illiterate sharecroppers coordinate protests involving thousands of participants across multiple states? The answer lay in institutional knowledge that black churches had been accumulating. Since slavery, they had mastered the art of invisible organization under the noses of hostile surveillance. The most sophisticated operation centered on Highlander folk. School's network of church-based training centers. Rhoda Parks had attended citizenship school at Highlander before her arrest sparked the Montgomery boycott. Fannie Lou Hamer learned political organizing at church-sponsored workshops before challenging the all-white Mississippi delegation at the 1964 Democratic Convention. Diane Nash coordinated the Nashville sit-ins from the basement of First Baptist Church, Capitol Hill. As 1961 turned into 1962, FBI surveillance reports revealed growing alarm at the organizational capabilities of black churches. J. Edgar Hoover's agents described a sophisticated network of religious institutions that functioned as command and control centers for subversive activities. What they failed to understand was that these churches weren't coordinating revolution in spite of their religious mission, they were fulfilling it. But as the movement's success grew, so did the danger. White supremacists were learning to target not just individual churches, but the entire network that connected them. The Underground Railroad that had once carried slaves to freedom was now transporting information and resources that threatened the entire system of racial oppression. And somewhere in the shadows, enemies were planning an attack that would test whether faith alone could withstand the fury of those who profited from hate. The teenage girl adjusting her white gloves outside Kelly Ingram Park didn't look like a soldier preparing for battle. Dorothy Malone, 16 years old with carefully pressed hair and her mother's best Sunday dress, was about to face trained police officers wielding clubs, dogs, and high-pressure fire hoses. Behind her marched hundreds of other young people, their ages ranging from 6 to 18, all dressed as if attending church service rather than confronting the violent machinery of segregation. This was Birmingham in May 1963, and black churches had made a decision that would horrify parents and electrify the world. They would deploy their children as the primary weapons in the war against Jim Crow. The strategy wasn't born from recklessness, but from cold calculation. Adults who participated in protests lost jobs that entire families depended upon. But students could afford to fill Birmingham's jails without destroying their community's economic survival. 16th Street Baptist Church had become the movement's primary staging ground, its sanctuary transformed into a boot camp for nonviolent warfare. Reverend James Bevel conducted training sessions that taught teenagers how to protect their heads from police batons, how to curl into protective positions when attacked by dogs, and how to maintain dignity while being dragged to paddy wagons by officers determined to break their spirits. The children who marched out of that church carried more than moral authority. They bore the accumulated rage and hope of generations who had been forced to swallow their pride and accept degradation. Ruby Bridges, who had integrated New Orleans schools at age 6, inspired thousands of other children to believe they could change America simply by refusing to accept the limitations white supremacy tried to impose upon their futures. 9-year-old Audrey Faye Hendricks became the youngest person arrested during the Children's Crusade, but her small hands gripping cell bars created an image that newspapers couldn't ignore. The optics were devastating for Birmingham's power structure. Armed police officers dragging elementary school students away from churches where they had been praying for equality and justice. America was watching, and the sight was unbearable. The strategic brilliance of using children became apparent within days. Birmingham's jails, designed to hold adult criminals, overflowed with teenagers singing freedom songs from overcrowded cells. The city's entire law enforcement apparatus ground to a halt, trying to process over 3,000 young protesters. Meanwhile, their parents continued working, ensuring that Birmingham's economic boycotts maintained maximum pressure on white businesses. White supremacist leaders recognized immediately that these weren't random protests but carefully orchestrated campaigns emerging from black churches that had spent months preparing their youngest members for confrontation. Sunday school classes had been studying nonviolent resistance tactics. Youth choirs had been practicing freedom songs that would sustain morale during imprisonment. Church mothers had been sewing protest banners and packing jail survival kits. When Police Commissioner Bull Connor unleashed attack dogs and fire hoses on children who were literally wearing their Sunday best, the images broadcast around the world revealed the moral bankruptcy of segregation in ways that adult protests never could. 6-year-olds being knocked down by water cannons powerful enough to strip bark from trees. Teenage girls in white dresses being savaged by German shepherds trained to attack human beings. The black churches that had organized these demonstrations watched with mixture of pride and anguish as their youth faced violence that would have broken adults. But the children held firm, singing "We Shall Overcome" while being loaded into police vans. maintaining nonviolent discipline while being beaten by officers who seemed determined to prove that even children weren't safe from white supremacy's wrath. International news coverage focused on the brutality, but the real story was unfolding in Birmingham's black churches, where teenagers returned each evening to report on jail conditions, share intelligence about police tactics, and prepare for the next day's confrontations. These sanctuaries had become military command posts where children planned campaigns that would ultimately force the federal government to intervene on behalf of civil rights. The strategy's success was measured not just in headlines or legislative changes, but in the transformation of young people who discovered they possessed power that centuries of oppression couldn't eliminate. These church-trained warriors would carry their confidence and organizational skills to college campuses, into professional careers, and eventually into positions of political leadership that would reshape American society. But as images of brutalized children filled television screens across America, white supremacists understood that black churches had found a weapon more powerful than anything they had previously deployed. The innocence and courage of young people singing hymns while facing down armed oppression created moral clarity that no propaganda could obscure. And in response, the enemies of equality began planning attacks that would target not just adult organizers or symbolic buildings, but the children themselves. The phone call that shattered the Sunday morning silence at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church carried news that would haunt America forever. At 10:22 a.m. on September 15, 1963, the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham had been bombed during Sunday school. 4 little girls were dead. 22 others were injured. The war against black churches had claimed its most innocent victims, and the movement faced its darkest hour. Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. stood in his Montgomery sanctuary, his hands trembling as he gripped the telephone receiver. The voices on the other end were barely coherent through their grief and rage. Denise McNair, 11 years old, Addie Mae Collins, 14, Cynthia Wesley, 14, Carol Robertson, 14. Their names would be carved into the conscience of a nation that had allowed hatred to flourish in its midst. The bombers had chosen their target with calculated precision. 16th Street Baptist wasn't just any church. It was the headquarters where children had been trained for the protests that broke Birmingham's segregation system just months earlier. The basement where the girls died had been the staging area for the children's crusade that had embarrassed white supremacists in front of the entire world. This wasn't random terrorism. It was strategic warfare against the movement's most sacred spaces. Within hours, every black church in America became a crime scene in the eyes of grieving congregations. Sunday services transformed into memorial gatherings where preachers struggled to find words that could explain how Christian civilization had produced monsters who would murder children at prayer. The faith that had sustained centuries of struggle now faced its ultimate test. Could it survive the deliberate slaughter of innocents? The investigation that followed revealed the sophisticated intelligence network that white supremacists had developed to target black churches. FBI files, released decades later, showed that bombers had studied floor plans, worship schedules, and security arrangements with military precision. They knew exactly when children would be in the basement preparing for morning service. They had planned mass murder with the cold calculation of professional assassins. Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth, himself a bombing survivor, stood in the rubble of 16th Street Baptist and spoke words that would echo through history. This is not just an attack on 4 little girls. This is an attack on the future of black America. The bombers understood that churches didn't just organize adults, they shaped children who would grow up to challenge white supremacy's hold on American society. The funerals became political rallies, disguised as religious ceremonies. At St. John's African Methodist Episcopal Church, over 8,000 mourners packed the sanctuary to hear Dr. King deliver Denise McNair's eulogy. His words carried the weight of centuries. These children, unoffending, innocent, and beautiful, were the victims of one of the most vicious and tragic crimes ever perpetrated against humanity. The eulogies weren't just remembering the dead, they were declaring war on the system that killed them. White authorities watched nervously as black churches across the South filled with mourners whose grief was rapidly transforming into revolutionary fury. The non-violent discipline that had characterized the movement began cracking under the weight of unbearable loss. In Birmingham's black neighborhoods, young men who had embraced peaceful protest started collecting weapons and talking about armed resistance. The economic retaliation was swift and systematic. White-owned businesses that had remained neutral during previous protests suddenly found themselves targeted by boycotts organized from church basements where memorial services for the bombing victims had been held. The message was clear. Anyone who remained silent while children were murdered would pay an economic price for their complicity. International reaction focused on the moral failure of American democracy, but foreign journalists missed the deeper story unfolding in black churches, where congregations were grappling with questions that struck at the heart of Christian faith. How could a loving God allow innocent children to be murdered while preparing for Sunday school? How could nonviolent resistance continue in the face of such unspeakable evil? The answers came not from theologians or political leaders, but from the church mothers who had raised these communities through generations of struggle. In fellowship halls across the South, elderly women who had survived slavery's aftermath witnessed lynchings and buried countless victims of racial violence, shared wisdom that would sustain the movement through its darkest period. The children didn't die for nothing if we don't let their deaths be for nothing. The bombing had been designed to break the spirit of black churches and terrorize communities into submission. Instead, it created martyrs whose memory would inspire even more determined resistance. Every black church in America became a shrine to Denise, Addie Mae, Cynthia, and Carol. Every Sunday service became a reminder that the price of freedom had been paid in the blood of innocents who deserved justice. But as 1963 turned toward 1964, the movement faced a terrible choice: continue the nonviolent path that had led children to their deaths, or embrace the armed resistance that growing numbers of young people were demanding. The black churches that had served as headquarters for peaceful revolution now had to decide whether they could maintain their commitment to love in the face of hatred that murdered children at prayer. The basement of Brown Chapel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Selma, Alabama, hummed with a different energy as 1964 dawned. The folding chairs that once held children learning Sunday school lessons now seated hardened activists studying maps of Dallas County's most dangerous rural roads. The mimeograph machines that had printed church bulletins now produced voter registration flyers warning of the violence that awaited anyone bold, enough to challenge white supremacy's grip on political power. Reverend Frederick Reese understood that the Birmingham church bombing had fundamentally changed the mathematics of the civil rights struggle. Nonviolence remained the movement's official strategy, but the congregation filing into Brown Chapel carried a new hardness in their eyes. They had watched children die for the crime of attending Sunday school, and their patience with gradual progress was rapidly evaporating. The voter registration campaigns that emerged from Selma's black churches bore little resemblance to the hopeful citizenship drives of previous years. These were military-style operations planned by people who understood that white supremacists would use any level of violence to prevent black political participation. Church deacons, who had never considered owning weapons, now kept shotguns hidden in their homes. Sunday school teachers learned to recognize unmarked cars that followed them home from meetings. Fanny, Lou Hamer's voice carried across the sanctuary, with the power of an Old Testament prophet calling down judgment on Pharaoh's army. Her testimony about beatings suffered in Mississippi jails for attempting to register voters transformed church services into recruitment rallies for the most dangerous assignment in America: challenging white political monopoly in the heart of the Deep South. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee organizers who arrived in Selma found black churches that had already evolved into sophisticated intelligence networks. Local congregants provided detailed information about sheriff's department patrol schedules, identified which white citizens were likely to resort to violence, and maintained communication systems that could instantly alert communities to developing threats. These churches weren't just hosting the movement, they were commanding it. 25-year-old John Lewis stood at the pulpit of Brown Chapel, his head still bandaged from a beating received during an earlier protest, addressing an audience that included teenagers who had decided they would rather die fighting for voting rights than live as second-class citizens. The non-violent philosophy he preached was increasingly challenged by young voices demanding armed self-defense against terrorist attacks. The economic warfare that accompanied voter registration campaigns was planned with the precision of corporate strategy sessions. Church basement meetings identified white-owned businesses that could be brought to their knees through coordinated boycotts. Congregations organized alternative economic networks that allowed black communities to survive without patronizing establishments that supported violent suppression of voting rights. FBI surveillance reports from this period revealed growing alarm at the organizational sophistication emerging from black churches. J. Edgar Hoover's agents described paramilitary-style training in church buildings where participants learned not just protest tactics but survival skills necessary for operating in hostile territory. Sunday afternoon workshops taught everything from first aid, treatment for beating victims, to secure communication methods that couldn't be easily monitored. The transformation was most visible in the young people who had survived the Birmingham bombing and emerged with steel in their spines. These teenagers, many of whom had lost friends in the 16th Street Baptist Church attack, brought a militancy to voter registration efforts that terrified white authorities who had grown comfortable with black political powerlessness. Church youth groups became recruitment centers for the most dangerous assignments in the most violent counties. Bloody Sunday's approach on March 7, 1965, represented the culmination of months of military-style planning that had taken place in Brown Chapel's basement. The marchers who assembled weren't naive protesters hoping to appeal to white consciences. They were seasoned veterans of a struggle that had already claimed too many lives. They knew they were walking into violence that could kill them, but they marched anyway because the alternative was accepting permanent subjugation. The medical supplies, legal observers, and emergency communication systems that supported the Selma to Montgomery March revealed the sophisticated infrastructure that black churches had developed to sustain campaigns in the face of state-sponsored terrorism. These congregations had learned to function as complete support systems for revolution, providing everything from tactical planning to psychological counseling for traumatized activists. When Alabama state troopers attacked peaceful marchers on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, the images broadcast worldwide showed more than police brutality. They revealed the courage of people who had been forged in church sanctuaries that had themselves survived bombings, shootings, and constant threats. These weren't victims being beaten. They were warriors who had accepted the possibility of death as the price of political freedom. The blood spilled on Bloody Sunday wasn't just the result of state violence. It was the inevitable consequence of black churches' decision to move from prayer to direct political action. The headquarters of the civil rights struggle had evolved into something white supremacists could no longer ignore or contain. And in Washington, D.C., politicians were finally beginning to understand that they could either pass voting rights legislation or watch American cities burn as the movement's patience reached its breaking point. The pen President Lyndon Johnson lifted on August 6, 1965, to sign the Voting Rights Act carried the weight of centuries of struggle that had been planned, coordinated, and sustained in the basements and sanctuaries of America's black churches. As television cameras recorded the historic moment, representatives from Brown Chapel, 16th Street Baptist, Dexter Avenue Baptist, and dozens of other congregations stood witness to legislation that their years of organizing, sacrifice, and strategic brilliance had finally forced into existence. But the victory celebration that night in Selma's Brown Chapel revealed how profoundly the civil rights struggle had transformed both the movement and the churches that had served as its headquarters. The congregation that gathered to praise God for political breakthrough bore little resemblance to the community that had begun meeting in secret just a few years earlier. These were battle-tested veterans who had faced down state troopers, survived bombings, and buried children martyred for the crime of demanding equality. Reverend C.T. Vivian stood at the pulpit, where so many strategies had been developed, and spoke words that captured the magnitude of what black churches had accomplished. We didn't just win the right to vote. We proved that faith combined with organization can defeat any system of oppression. We showed America and the world that ordinary people worshiping in humble buildings possess the power to reshape nations. The infrastructure that had enabled this victory extended far beyond Selma or even the South. From Harlem's Abyssinian Baptist Church to Los Angeles's First African Methodist Episcopal, black congregations had created the most effective grassroots political network in American history. They had mastered voter registration, fundraising, communications, logistics, legal support, and community organizing while maintaining their primary mission as houses of worship. Young people who had been recruited from Sunday school classes to face police dogs and fire hoses were now entering colleges with full scholarships, attending law schools, and preparing for careers in politics, business, and social justice that would extend the movement's influence for generations. The Children's Crusade that had broken Birmingham's segregation system was producing leaders who would reshape American society in ways their enemies never imagined possible. The economic networks that had sustained boycotts and funded bail bonds evolved into sophisticated business development programs that created black-owned banks, insurance companies, and professional services firms. Church-based credit unions that had financed freedom rides were now providing mortgages that allowed families to purchase homes in previously all-white neighborhoods. The movement's financial expertise had laid foundations for long-term economic advancement. But victory also brought new challenges that tested black churches' ability to adapt their mission to changed circumstances. The legal barriers that had clearly defined the enemy were falling, but systemic racism was evolving into more subtle forms that required different strategies and tactics. Churches that had mastered the art of confronting obvious injustice now faced the more complex task of addressing institutional discrimination that operated through seemingly neutral policies and procedures. The assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. on April 4th, 1968, at the Lorraine Motel in Memphis represented more than the murder of a charismatic leader. It was an attack on the entire network of black churches that had produced and sustained the civil rights revolution. The man killed that evening was not just an individual minister, but the embodiment of institutional knowledge and strategic vision that had emerged from generations of struggle rooted in religious community. The riots that erupted in over 100 cities following King's assassination revealed both the movement's success and its limitations. Black churches had proven they could organize massive non-violent campaigns that forced political change, but they struggled to address the rage of urban communities that had been largely excluded from the Southern-focused civil rights campaigns. The headquarters of the struggle faced a new challenge: how to remain relevant to younger generations who questioned both non-violence and traditional religious authority. The Black Power movement that emerged in the late 1960s represented both a rejection and an evolution of the church-based organizing that had characterized the early civil rights movement. Young activists like Stokely Carmichael and H. Rap Brown criticized the accommodationist tendencies they perceived in religious leadership. But they also adopted many of the organizational strategies and community-building techniques that black churches had perfected. By 1970, the black churches that had served as headquarters for the civil rights struggle faced a fundamental question. What was their role now that the most blatant legal barriers to equality had been removed? Some congregations retreated into traditional religious activities, satisfied that their political mission had been accomplished. Others recognized that the struggle for true equality had merely entered a new phase that required different but equally sophisticated strategies. The legacy of black churches' role as headquarters for the civil rights movement extends far beyond the legislation passed or the barriers broken in the 1950s and 1960s. They had demonstrated that religious institutions could serve as powerful agents of social change without compromising their spiritual mission. They had proven that oppressed communities possessed the capacity for sophisticated political organization even under the most hostile conditions. Today, as new movements for social justice emerge around issues of police brutality, economic inequality, and educational equity, organizers are rediscovering strategies and tactics that black churches developed during their decades as headquarters for the freedom struggle. The lesson that faith, organization, and strategic patience can overcome seemingly impossible odds continues to inspire communities fighting for justice in America and around the world. The 4 little girls who died in the bombing of 16th Street Baptist Church, Denise McNair,